All right, great. Well, I'm excited to be here at my very first WP campus and be speaking with you today about how WordPress can be used as the center of your higher ed print publication workflows. My name is Ben Greeley, as you just heard. I'm the Director of Engineering at 10up. 10up is a digital agency where we specialize in building large enterprise WordPress solutions. We have a lot of different types of clients, but we also have clients in higher education and publishing as well. I've worked in higher education for nearly a decade. I worked at Colby College as their web manager slash programmer slash whatever else I needed to be doing. I wore many hats. And before that, I worked as a web developer at the University of Maine in Orono, Maine. As you can see from these GIFs, I'm from Maine and I'm from the other Portland, so it's awesome to be here in this Portland with that new Portland smell. So yeah, let's get started and talk about some print publications. How many of you here work in either a communications office or involved in your college's print publications? All right, so there's quite a few of you. Let's talk about the types of print publications that are often used in higher education, because there's always so many of them. There's a lot of types of publications like alumni magazines, which get sent out to your alums, course catalogs, which are sent out to current students so that they can pick out their courses. There's admissions brochures and magazines and whatnot to get students interested in coming to visit your college. And annual reports. So annual reports are usually sent out to donors or alums or anyone else who's interested in receiving those. Since it's 2019, there's usually a web version of all these publications as well. And there's a number of workflows for getting the content into both the web version and the print versions of these things. So I want to start out by talking about the different workflows that are usually used so that we can kind of be on the same page there. Now, your communications office may use a different workflow or set of tools than the ones I'm going to be talking about. That's totally fine. I'm going to be talking more in general terms about the types of steps that are usually taken to get content into print and onto web. But usually what happens is an editorial workflow starts in either Microsoft Word, InCopy, or Google Docs, or basically anywhere people can collaborate and have comments and versions of documents. Usually there's different roles like editors or content contributors who are actually writing the content. And once that content is deemed ready for the world, it's usually copied and pasted somewhere, either on the web or in print. Like I said, sometimes the content starts and is written with the web in mind, and sometimes it's written with print in mind. It all depends on your content strategy and what this content that you're writing is going to be used for. If we dig into a web-first workflow for content that's going to be put on the web first, a lot of times this is the sort of content that is very timely. So news, basically news articles, more important like alumni profiles you might want to have featured on your website before it goes into print. This workflow starts out, again, like with this editorial workflow in like Google Docs, in some sort of collaborative software. Once it's ready to be published online, it's then copied and pasted, hopefully in the WordPress, but if you're not in the WordPress yet, it's usually copied into your CMS of choice that you're using. Once it's online and after whatever amount of time that is appropriate to put it in your print brochures or magazines, it's then either copied and pasted, sometimes from the web or from that print editorial workflow as well. So sometimes there's a different version for the print than there is for web, so that can complicate things as well. So that editorial workflow might have a version for web and a version for print, and you usually have to maintain the two versions to get them in sync at some point. The reason that you usually write them a little bit differently is because for print, you usually have like a one-page space that you can use, and it's very concrete. Whereas on the web, as you know, you can just keep on writing till the cows come home. So yeah. Much like a web-first workflow, the print-first workflow basically has the same set of tools. You start in an editorial workflow that, instead of going on the web first, is copied into InDesign, where the print designer then lays it out, makes it pretty. Then that's sent out to a mailing house, where it usually is mailed out to whoever is supposed to receive the publications. Sometimes when it needs to go on the web, that's then copied directly from the InDesign version, which can be messy. And then sometimes it can also, like I was talking about earlier, have its own version in the editorial workflow. So that's sometimes copied onto WordPress from there. a few examples of why you might use a print first workflow is if you have like alumni profiles or stories in your alumni magazine that isn't really that timely. You might decide to put it into the print first, work on getting the assets and design and stuff like that laid out, and then put it onto the web. But the big thing is that you have to jump between all these different tools. It's pretty inefficient, and there's a lot of inefficiencies keeping different versions in sync. If you put something on the web that was already in print and you realize, oh crap, now I have to change some details because some facts changed, you have to then trace back into the print version if it hasn't gone to the mailhouse already, or basically send out a revised version at some point. So it can get kind of messy. 10up has worked with a lot of publishers, like I said, and we worked with a publishing company called Maine Today Media, which is a big publishing company in Maine. And we worked with them to help make WordPress the central point of their web and print workflows. So I'm going to be talking more about that. A little bit about Maine Today Media. We've been working with them for a number of years now. I'd say probably like 6 or so years. They have a lot of publications in the form of newspapers that they produce. So they have 4 daily newspapers that they produce. They also have like a dozen or so regional and monthly and weekly newspapers that they produce as well. Oh boy. Hang on, we just lost video, and there it is again. So where was I? So yeah, Maine Today Media has a lot of different newspapers they produce. They also are the biggest media producer in the state of Maine. So these are the largest newspapers that we produce. They have an existing WordPress multi-site environment, which we help maintain and help create. They are pressherald.com, centralmaine.com, and sunjournal.com. Those sites get a ton of traffic, and they produce content a lot of times daily. So these are very, very active websites that have a lot of posts. This is an example of the front page of their print newspaper. They have different stories that are laid out within InDesign, and then these print stories usually are represented online, but not always. So there's usually a web version that's sometimes a little bit different print. That's actually my wife. This is some work that she's been doing with asylum seekers that have come to Maine this summer, so had to show off her on the front page of the Portland Press Herald. So back to the story about Maine Today Media. So they came to us with a vision for having a central place for their web and print workflows. One of the big issues that they were having was that their legacy software was closed source. Legacy software for printing was closed source. It was old. It had a really clunky interface that people just hated using. So they also wanted to move away from that system and move things somewhere. They didn't really care where, but just away from that system. That legacy system was extremely expensive, so that was also one of the main reasons why they wanted to move away. They wanted to create a central location for their web and print workflows. So remember I was showing the charts about the way that stuff is entered onto the web first or print first. They wanted to eliminate that because a lot of times for them, web first and print first is a difference of like a few hours because they have daily newspapers. So they wanted to eliminate that need to kind of think that way. They also wanted to improve the content sharing between the different web and print properties. So they have different newspapers, and even though Maine is a very big state geographically, there's not a ton of news that might be specific to one area. So they want to usually share stories between the different regions. Each of those regions needed to write things a little bit differently. So if you have like a big basketball game that was played between Portland and Lewiston, and Portland won and Lewiston lost, you wouldn't write, Portland wins, hallelujah, on the Lewiston newspaper. You'd probably have a little bit of a different headline. So they needed that sort of flexibility. They also wanted to streamline workflows between the different newspapers. Each newspaper is also geographically separated from each other. So they have evolved and created their own separate workflows over the years. And they wanted to kind of bring that back all together and make sure each newspaper was doing things consistently. So one of the things that we created was a site on their multi-site network as like the main place for their content syndication and content creation. All web and print content can be created in the same place, and this is all within WordPress in a private site that is only accessible through WP admin. As stories changed and evolved, there wasn't really any need to jump between the different tools I was showing earlier. So there's no need to jump into Microsoft Word or InCopy. It's all the collaboration is done within WordPress. There's a bunch of editorial tools, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, which were also implemented into WordPress to help achieve that. The web content is created in the central site and then pushed to the various websites. So if there is a story created on the central site and it was supposed to be used on 2 separate websites, we used a plugin called Distributor that we created that takes that content and then pushes it to various websites. So that could be to a single site, that could be to multiple sites, but the user at the end of that transfer could then choose to unlink that version, or they could still receive the updates from the main central website for that newspaper. So this is how they could achieve like changing the headlines a little bit for one newspaper over another. And this content site also served as the server for their print content, which then got sent into InDesign, which I'll talk about in a little bit. One of the big things that was important to create for this system was custom roles and workflows. So they've been using this legacy print system for a long time. And unfortunately, the editorial staff got really used to the way that it worked, and they didn't want to have to relearn it. So we rebuilt this workflow within WordPress using various custom post types, various roles, and basically rebuilt that workflow so that they had an editor be able to review content that a reporter had written and be able to approve various photos that were added by photographers. We leveraged functionality that was in Editflow. So Editflow is a plugin that was built by Automatic, and it's been around for quite a while, but it has a lot of great features and functionality we were able to build logic on top of. So we didn't have to recreate the wheel for a lot of things. Some of that functionality included email notifications. So as the statuses are changing, emails were sent out to the various people that should be involved in the next steps. Like I said, custom post statuses were created as well. But it is worth noting that custom post statuses are not a thing that is supported in Gutenberg yet. So if you ever have to create custom post statuses, you might have to wait a little while to have a Gutenberg-friendly site that you're using. You'd have to use the classic editor. I have seen that there's a lot of talk about this in GitHub, so I think at some point in the near future we'll probably have custom post statuses, but for right now that's not really possible. So one of the things that we had to create too was a bunch of different types of content. One of these content types was a web story, which is essentially a post, but it has a lot of collaboration tools built into it so that when reporters and editors were collaborating, they could highlight certain text, leave a comment, and leave different revisions and versions of the story as they revised it and made it better. Wow, my adapter is not very friendly today. So we also created this concept of having working drafts of published stories. So as you may know, when you publish a story in WordPress, it has a status of published. There really isn't a way to change that custom status back and go through the workflow again if you had more changes that had to go through. So we created working drafts of stories so that you could have a draft some people are working on the published story, get it approved and go through the workflow, and then have it get merged back into the published story and overwrite the content. And that was really useful for them. And this screenshot is an example of how distributors use. So Distributor, you can select the websites that you want to copy a story out to and push the content out to those various sites. Another content type we created is a print story. Print stories, as you may think from the name of it, are used for print only. Stories can be created by either web or print initially, or they can be duplicated into one or another. So Maine Today Media had a need to not really have to define this is the web version, this is the print version. They wanted to just write a story and then determine, okay, this needs to be for web, so we're going to make a web version of this, and this is going to be for print, so we're going to make a print version of this. The print stories are a little bit different, where you cannot embed, make embeds, have hyperlinks, do basically anything that you can't have in a print newspaper. So it has a stripped down editor in that sense, but it has a custom taxonomy for each print story. So this taxonomy allows you to select the newspaper that the story is associated with. And this is important because each newspaper has its own types of print styles. These print styles in the newspapers differ because, like I said, each newspaper is kind of separate and geographically different. And also, Maine Today Media has ended up purchasing newspapers over time, because as newspapers threaten to shut down, they've kept them going in the various regions. So this is one of the reasons why we had to have separate print styles, which can be applied to the text. And then I'll show you in a bit how that text is then put into InDesign. Yeah, so let's go to the next one. So another type of content we created is a package. A package is basically a collection of content that goes into a story. So here's an example of the asylum seeker story. We can see at one glance that there's a web version and a print version, and that one was shared and another one's in design. You can also see that there's a bunch of photos that were added that could be added to either the print version or the web version, depending on how they want to use it. You can see the receivers that are going to be getting the email notification. So it basically gave Maine Today Media a quick glance of where stories stand. You might have a story that's in multiple. I apologize for that, but it will come back. You might have a story that might be in multiple newspapers, and that list might be very long, because you'll have like a print version of one story that's very different from another print version, and you'll want to just make sure that the editorial staff could see where those were and what was published. So this was really important to Maine Today Media, to be able to have like a one look at a story and see what's created for it. So this is where I think things get a little bit fun. We had to figure out how to get content from WordPress into InDesign. They were using InDesign CS6, which I'm not sure, what new capabilities are in the newest version of InDesign, but there's a lot of things we had to work through in CS6 as far as engineering-wise. Essentially, print designers needed to still use InDesign with this workflow. The reason for which is we really can't rebuild InDesign in WordPress. We probably could if we had enough time, but who has time for that? And I don't think the experience would be nearly as good. So one of the stipulations is that the designers still had to use InDesign, and Maine Today Media really didn't want the designers to have to go into WordPress, find a story, export it, and then import it back into InDesign. So what we created was a plugin for InDesign itself, which allows the designers to search for WordPress content based on categories, the publication date, the part of the newspaper it's supposed to go in, and basically was able to find the stories that way. It used a REST API endpoint that is custom, and that REST API endpoint served one of these print stories to InDesign. And I'll dig into that a little bit. So this is an example of the output of that REST API endpoint. You don't really need to read it, but it's in JSON format, and it has basically all the parts of the print story that you'll need to create it. One of the things that's on there, which would probably be good if I made it a little bit bigger, but it returns the print content in IDML format. So this is the InDesign markup language in XML. So this includes the print styles that were applied in that print story. It converts that, the HTML that's created in WordPress, and then has a version that InDesign can actually consume and import. And we'll see if this actually works if I'm on the Wi-Fi. There's a video I'm going to be playing. And if not, I can just open up. So this is InDesign, and if you open up the WordPress plugin, you can see the different facets that you can use to search for content. And this is on my local, so we're not going to have a whole bunch of exciting content, but there's a test print post that I created. I select it. I can import it. I didn't have the fonts, unfortunately, and I probably should have had those fonts for the video, but that's why I got that warning. But you can see that that got flowed into InDesign, and this is a WordPress post. And if I don't show you the WordPress version of it right now, there's another video in just a little bit where I show you from the WordPress side of things. But now, if I'm a print designer, I can then lay things out. I can change the text. I could add images. If there were images from WordPress, those would be flowed in here as well in raw format. So yeah, that was pretty cool. One of the needs that the designers had was to also have content that goes from InDesign to WordPress. So let's say you had a print story, it was written awesome, it was written in like the perfect way for the web, but when you flowed it into InDesign, it was over by like 5 words or something. So Maine Today Media needed a way to let the editors know that this content's too long and they should go back and reformat it. Because the print designer really shouldn't be making those calls. They shouldn't be changing the text on the fly. So what we created is an addition to the plugin in InDesign that allows the designers to basically make the changes that they need to the story in InDesign and then flow that content back into WordPress. So once it goes into WordPress, it creates a new revision of the story so they can always jump back and see the differences between the two versions. It uses a REST API endpoint, so this is a different endpoint that allows content to be pushed to it, and it allows, InDesign to overwrite the data. It also sends an email notification to the editorial staff to let them know that changes are needed. And I'll show you a video of how this works. So again, this is InDesign. InDesign has a little overset indicator here to showing that the text actually is overset and it's not going to flow well. So if we open up this story in WordPress, this is the version of the story before any changes are made. You can see there aren't really anything except for lorem ipsum, the byline, headline. So within InDesign, the designer would go in and say export to WordPress, which it does. And then if we jump back into WordPress, which we will, and we're going to reload this as well. If the print designer had made some content changes, so changed the headline a little bit, those changes would be in here as well. So we reload, and because this was my local, it's pretty darn slow. So you can see on the top it says there's a backup of the version. That's just saying that there's another version of this that might be newer. There's some annotation tools for commenting that the editor could use to figure out what's going on. Like there could be a message left within InDesign. But there's the overset message that's saying, hey, right here is where the overset is. In the email message, I think I gave more explicit directions of what to do, but this is basically just saying this is where the overset is. So the editor can jump in and make the changes that they need. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think this is just showing the annotation settings, so you could leave a comment on some words. So if like that's the wrong word to use, they could leave a comment on there and say we should use a different word than this. So Maine Today Media has been using this workflow and this setup for probably 7 months or so, since December 2018. They started with one smaller newspaper just to make sure that there weren't any kinks to get worked out, which there inevitably were, of course, but they eventually rolled it out to their bigger newspapers. And since then, pretty much every daily newspaper is being created within WordPress, and all their web content's also being created within WordPress, which is pretty awesome. As other newspapers are being brought in to use this, so remember they have like other regional newspapers and weekly newspapers. They've also been adhering to the standards and workflows that this system provides, and so they've been able to create efficiencies in their workflows and patterns, so things are a little bit more predictable for them. So going back into higher education, because that's what we're talking about here, you can see that this is a very powerful way for you to maybe save some time, is having a central location for having both web and print edits. I worked in the communications office for about 8 years. I understand that there's a ton to do, and having some sort of way to save even like an hour or so of like a workflow of creating a magazine or a catalog or something would go a long way. So there are tools that you can use, which I'll talk about in a little bit, so that you can get started on using WordPress for your print publication workflows. But if you had like a course catalog that goes online first, because obviously students aren't going to wait for the print publication to find the courses, but then you want to create like a print version of that, you could easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, you could theoretically set up a setup so that you could flow content from WordPress about the course catalog into InDesign without having to have that middle software of InCopy or Word or whatever else you might use. Like I said, here's some resources that you can use to get started. And like if you have a WordPress site already, a lot of these are pretty easy to set up. All these are free and open source, so you can contribute to it if you find any bugs. I was talking about Editflow. Editflow is, like I said, a pretty old plugin as far as WordPress years, but it doesn't mean it's not very good. It works quite well. The only thing that doesn't work, like I was talking about, is Gutenberg support at the moment. So I'm sure at some point Automatic will be releasing a version of that. But you can download that, I think, at editflow.com. And it has a lot of functionality that we didn't use for the Maine Today Media project, like editorial calendars. Yeah, there was a lot of different editorial functionality that we didn't necessarily need for this project that you might be able to use in your newsroom. Another tool that I was talking about earlier is Distributor. So this is that plugin that allows you to create content on one site on the multi-site network and then push it to one or more sites. So like I was saying, you can have Distributor set up and push content, and every time you make changes to that central site, those changes will be reflected on the other sites. But then there's the flexibility of having those other sites unlink themselves from that central site if they want to take things a little bit differently. They won't get the content updates moving forward, but they might, that might be necessary for the workflow that you want. Also, Distributor allows you to push from site to site, so not necessarily in a multi-site environment, but you could push from one WordPress site to another. So if you had like a content staging site, you could theoretically push that to like a production site if that was your workflow. So that's a pretty cool plugin. So you should check that out sometime. There's also 8-Day-Week. So this is another plugin we created a couple of years ago. And what is cool about 8-Day-Week, it gives you a lot of tools for editorial workflows. Like basically, I believe it has the idea of like having an issue for a magazine. So you can create an issue and then add articles to that issue. But this gives you functionality to export XML, export the IDML XML for InDesign from a WordPress post. It isn't as slick as what I just showed you as far as like being just within InDesign, like that was something we built just for Maine Today Media. But this allows you to export something in an XML file, and then in InDesign you could theoretically import it. And if those extra steps aren't a big deal, this is something you can get started with pretty easily. There is a new version coming out sometime in the near future that solves some compatibility issues with the newest version of WordPress. So if you check back in a couple of weeks or so, it should be able to be run on the most current versions of WordPress. All right, so that's it. I guess I was pretty fast. We probably have another 15 minutes or so, but we have time for questions. Yeah.
You talked about a designer can update a post and then it gets sent back to WordPress.
Yep.
Does that get sent back to WordPress in a published state? And if so, what controls are there around the governance of, is that person allowed to just publish or?
Yeah, so the question was, if you are in InDesign and you send content back into WordPress, is there any sort of constraints to make sure that you're not, pushing anything back maliciously, or maybe you delete all the content accidentally or something? For their workflow, they have like different custom statuses for print posts. So I think if I remember, it was like a working status and then like ready for print status. I believe that when you sent it back from InDesign, it was still in that ready for print status. But basically, because of their workflow, the person pulling the InDesign file is the only person that would be using that file. So it's not like the web version of the file, the print version of the file is used on the web. It's just that one use. It probably would be a good idea if that was something that then created like a new version with another status or kicked it back. But for their workflow, that didn't really seem necessary. Yeah. Yeah.
So you build on Editflow. And by the way, I haven't used Editflow, but I'm planning to use Publish Press, which I guess is a kind of a commercial form of Editflow.
Okay.
Do you happen to know? I mean, I'm going to take the dive. This is just asking you about a plugin.
So just want to clarify the question. Right. So you're just wondering about that plugin and
yes,
how it can be used?
It seems to have a strong reputation, and maybe there are others who use other editorial workflow.
Yeah.
used a different one before. I'm thinking of migrating to Publish Press, which is also a fork of Editflow. And I don't know if Editflow itself is active. I am.
Editflow is active.
For compatibility. It looks like Publish Press is doing the best possible job of what they can.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't used Publish Press, is what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember seeing it online when I was seeing what sort of tools and stuff that would be best suited for this project.
Yeah.
You know, I do know that Automatic has pushed some changes to Editflow, so hopefully Publish Press can incorporate those changes. But you're right, like I think it was kind of stale for a while. Like it worked okay for the last versions of WordPress, but I think now that they see that there's some issues, they're looking to kind of revamp that. Yeah, I'm not sure about Publish Press. There's probably a lot of tools out there that you could use to implement workflows. I think I did see on the schedule there's actually somebody talking about another similar tool or something for workflows. So I think the big thing, at least from my perspective, is to make sure it's one you don't get necessarily too locked into. The good thing about Editflow, and I'm assuming Publish Press as well because it's forked off it, is that it has a lot of hooks and filters, and we were able to use those hooks and filters to build that logic layer on top. So we didn't have to change the code, which was instrumental. Yeah. Yeah. Good luck with implementing your workflows. Yeah.
This is just more a comment on that. So Editflow's been around for a long time.
Right.
WordPress.com was using it for their PHP clients, and that's part of why so when it had been abandoned for a long time, but it was being used by the Automatic company, then they added themselves, and there were some articles that were on like WPCampus or something like that, being like, this is an essential tool, why isn't it being updated?
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, we'll add it to the things that we're supporting. So because the Automatic staff are using it for their PHP clients, I don't think it's likely to go away or not be supported in the future. Like you're saying, I think if you look at the website for you, you can see that there's a lot of support from the top level team.
Definitely, and Publish Press could very well be like a very good tool. I've just never used it. Yep.
So I have a question. I was looking at 8-Day-Week. So we talked about catalogs. We keep our catalogs in WordPress, and then to print them, it's just to make a couple print copies. We have to have some available for people who demand them or ask when to get to them. It looks like 8-Day-Week, if I was to use that, I could create an issue basically with all of the pages for the entire catalog in there, and then push that issue directly, export it out, and put that into InDesign? Is that how you would?
That's the idea, yeah. So I wish I had a demo of 8-Day-Week set up, but it's a little less automatic as far as like you press export and it goes into InDesign. Yeah. So you press export, it creates a file that you download to your local computer. You then would import it into InDesign, and it would flow all that text in.
Yeah.
So that's the idea behind that.
But I would kind of lay it out, I was looking at the plugin, lay it out in WordPress in the 8-Day-Week to say the order that they want the pages to come in, and then it would come in that order in InDesign.
Yep, exactly. Okay. So it would save you that step of like copying and pasting, or probably InDesign has like some more sophisticated ways of doing this than like the version of InDesign I'm used to, but the version I knew, we had to copy and paste basically. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
We're in the editorial process, and you find the print papers, like actually start doing content in WordPress. I mean, during the beginning onto the article, or the wrote like the first or second read, like what point, were they really very on well?
So let me clarify that question. So are you asking about when they started inputting content into the new system, into that new site?
Like, I'm looking for writing a story, like writing automatically, they like automatically going to WordPress first.
Yep.
And start typing, or they kind of type in their Google Doc or whatever, that gets kind of shared.
So the idea is that they would go into WordPress. That's where they would start creating it. That's where the collaboration tools happen there. After it would go through the workflow at that point. So if I remember right, they had like a working status. Again, there's probably like a more elegant way that they named it. But then once that reporter was done writing it and they want an editor to look at it, they'd say like in review, and then that would contact the editor that was assigned to that story. So the idea is that it would all be within WordPress. My guess is that maybe they start in some other places just taking notes, just knowing reporters, like they might be taking notes as they go along, like when they're interviewing somebody, and then copy those into WordPress. But who knows, maybe they're using the mobile app or something for WordPress, and then they're adding a post. Yeah. I think probably for their workflow, it probably all depends on the person who's doing it. They're required to have that content in WordPress for the editors to review it, though. So that's the step I think that they just need to make sure it's in WordPress. Great. Are there any questions online? And I apologize for the HDMI cable or whatever's messing up here. And if there's no questions, we can just take off early. Yep.
I realize that the InDesign work you did is proprietary, you're not going to release it, but do you have a sense of how big a lift it is to do that, like make an InDesign? What does that work?
Yeah, so the question is, how big of a lift would I say it is to create like an InDesign plugin? And it's not a very simple process because I can't remember exactly which programming language that's written in. Like you can extend and create plugins for InDesign, but I think it's like an old version of like Visual Basic or something along those lines. So unfortunately, like I'm not the most proficient person with Visual Basic, so it took a little bit of a ramp up to learn that. But it's a programming language, so you can figure things out if you do enough Googling, and we're able to figure out how to get it to communicate with WordPress via REST API. In general terms, like I would just say it's a pretty big lift to create that. I used to work in higher education, like I said, and I think it would be difficult working in a capacity where that wasn't my sole focus to create it. There would be too many distractions to pull away, and we probably want to find like a more quicker way of implementing it. But I think the solution that was created was a lot more elegant and useful than necessarily like the exporting and importing. It works, but it's something that you'd have to go into WordPress and spend a little time exporting a file and then importing it into InDesign. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right, thank you. And